ease our way into it. But, just by way of introduction, Nancy, why don't you just give us however you communicate your identity to the public, like give us a brief bio about who you are and how you're joining us today.
I began writing plays when I was 50. I had no particular training, so I sought training at the Iowa Summer Writing Workshop. I took classes, I read books. I knew that I could use plays to tell stories that needed to be told. And I live in the same town as Actors Theater of Louisville, so that was a wonderful place to see good theater, and there's lots of community theaters around, and I kept thinking I could be part of this scene. And I studied, and I had some good success at the very beginning, or I might have given the whole thing up. The way I came to Anna Mae Clark's story was I was doing freelance writing and editing. I was given a book called Kentucky Women to edit. It was a collection of 2-page biographies of Kentucky women, and one of them was about Anna Mae Clark. She was an amazing woman. She was raised by somebody who couldn't read or write, but who insisted that she go to college. The grandmother raised them because the mother died when Anna Mae Clark was 11. In this biography was a story of Anna at Fort Des Moines. She had decided, she's a very patriotic woman, and she had decided she needed to be part of the war effort. So she was sent to Fort Des Moines after she was accepted into the Army, which she may not have ever been accepted except for the order that 10.6% of the Army would be black, as they said at the time, or Negro actually. So at Fort Des Moines, she was in officer candidate school, and there was a swimming pool there with a sign on it. The pool was available to officers 1 hour a week. The hour before, the pool was cleansed with chemicals. The black wax could only swim. Right before they cleaned the pool, I said, oh, this is horrible. How did she go on after an insult like that and do all the things she did? And so I began researching the play and found myself in, basements of libraries and reading congressional records and looking at federal regulations, interviewing her brother and his wife. Franklin was alive when I started working on the play. His wife, Clifforda, was there. And I had to be really careful. I wanted to be respectful. I mean, I'm a white woman, obviously. And I asked their permission. I said, if someone else is going to write this play, I will back off. But somebody needs to know your sister's story. So they gave me permission. And that's why you have a white writer telling the story of a black hero. And I'm glad I did it.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled I did it. I'm thrilled that Actors Warehouse in Gainesville is presenting her story, which happens to have Florida connections because she was influenced by Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune. So,
Indeed.
You want to ask me something else?
That was. What's wonderful about everything you said, I mean, it's a very rich narrative, right? So there's a lot to unpack in there, and there's a lot to unpack relative to the type of work that Stephen is doing in this city, the type of work that Anne is doing in this city. I mean, there is, especially through last year, even with my involvement with work with Stephen and work with Anne, there was a great kind of internal consideration for me about what allyship means, right? I mean, what is the way in terms of having a personal integrity to reach into a space in which you can lend your strength, your voice, your abilities, your capacity, your resources, but not try to as I've often found in the academic space, in which I've also spent a lot of time, where you just kind of drop down into the situation and say, this is how things must be because we've researched it and we've understood it, without really understanding people's personal narratives in a particular space. So I feel like the way that you found your way into, and how you describe your way into Anna's life, there was great, not only respect, but kind of there's a very genuine sense of what allyship looks like in that particular way, the way you approached it, the way you, kind of embraced that narrative with great care, right? So speaking to that, what is it then that connected when you read about Anna's life? How did that connect with your experience? And because that's really where we try to tie these things in together, right? You lived a very different experience than this woman did, and yet, in this kind of across space and time, the two of you have connected. Your heart connects with hers. What was it that really connected with you about her experience, and how did it speak to your own experience?
Well, I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, lived in a very white community. There was one African-American student at my high school.
Wow.
So, I met a few more African-Americans in college, but in fact, it was during college that I saw an ad for teachers. You had to be certified. You couldn't just be somebody in the education school. You had to be certified, so I had to wait till I graduated. But I went into teach at what essentially was a freedom school in Dorchester County, South Carolina. And I was just astounded at the racism and the poverty, and thrilled with the children I worked with. My co-teacher was from Nigeria. This was, again, a situation where it wasn't white people saving black people. It was people working together, respecting each other, caring, as you said, and preparing these kids to enter schools that were being integrated for the first time the next summer. And so I've always had a special place in my heart for African Americans. I mean, that might sound paternalistic. I worked closely with this community in South Carolina. In fact, I always wondered, when the program ended in a few years, but I always wondered what became of my students.
Yeah.
So I tried to get a grant. You may have looked at the book.
I did.
Yeah.
Yes.
I tried to get a grant to go back and find them again. I didn't know if I could find any of them, but I just wanted to know. So my husband, we had 4-year-old twin boys at the time.
Wow.
Yeah, I started late on that. Just like I started late. I was late.
Twins, no less.
Yeah, twins are us.
You just you go all the way in, don't you?
Well, actually, it helped to have twins. But my husband, whose name is Jan, said, don't worry about getting a grant. I've been turned down here and turned down there. He said, just go. Just do it. We'll make it work.
Wow.
And then I got a small grant from the Methodist Church and from the American Association of University Women.
Wow.
So I went, I put ads in their paper. I found one of my students. She said, I'll be happy to work with you on this. We found over 70 students.
Wow.
And most of them were still in the area, but most of them were doing quite well.
That's amazing.
The one I worked most closely with had a master's degree.
Remarkable.
So
what kind of reflections did they give you as you spoke to them?
The first person I went to, she lived in a trailer with her husband, and I hadn't been able to reach her in advance. I didn't have her exact address. It was back in the days when you wrote letters. So I knocked on the door and I said, you knew me as Nancy Gall. I was a teacher 20 years ago. I wanted to talk to my former students, and she came out on the stoop and kind of looked at me and said, oh yeah, I remember those strange people with books, because we brought lots of books, we gave lots of books away, and that's the name of my book, Strange People with Books.
Strange People, lovely.
So, I've stayed in touch with a few of those students, particularly the co-author, but I don't know if I've answered your question. You can start a new question or get me to.
Well, if I may, actually, Nancy, I want to thank you for putting something together like this and just getting insight into your past work at the Freedom School. I'm really impressed, because I was thumbing through the book and I was just like, wow, my goodness. And I think what I really want to thank you the most for is the respect that you've shown to Anna's character, for her life and her family. I should just say her character, but to her legacy and to her family. And like you said, as a white woman, what could you do? How can you approach this without, respectfully,
right,
offending anyone? And you did a very good job. I think it was probably, and I'm just going to go out on the limb, it's probably a little bit easier for you because it was a historical character, so it wasn't like something you were, just pulling together, out of the ethers. But it still could have gone wrong,
sure. Definitely.
But for so long in our society, the Black narrative was always controlled by those who were not Black, and so they told their story about us, really, and just fed it to everyone else. And so I was really grateful that you did go back and you really connected with Anna's brother and her sister-in-law and did your research. And I'm sure this was a time that you grew up during a segregated South, segregated time in our society as well too. So so you have an idea of I'm delighted that you allowed yourself to be open to understanding what Blacks in this country were going through at that time. I think the best way I can describe it is for someone who would be in your position but not be open to it, what I refer to them as willfully ignorant. So it's like, oh well, no, that's not the case, and but one of the other things that I really appreciate in their script is that very first scene between Franklin and Samuel, the porter. There was so much. There's so much insight as to the mindset of a Black person who is trying to survive in the Jim Crow South, and that was Samuel's situation.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it was just it really really resonated with me, but I think that spoke volumes to me. And I think all the scenes really were very touching. It was very inspiring, and the audiences have been definitely enjoying it.
Good.
So
I'm so glad.
Yeah.
I'm so
But
glad.
I guess what I would really want to say with that, just summing it up again, I just really want to thank you for being respectful and really drawing out those characters and making them real and not caricatures. So that was very good, especially Samuel's role. Yeah.
That's a very. I love that you brought that particular scene to mind, Stephen, because that particular character and the duality that's created there, right? That represents that there's almost this resistance to something that perhaps that character feels, or at least that's how I've interpreted it, right? That character has some degree of kind of looking twice at this situation, that this is a woman that is actually standing in a way that perhaps he wished he could have stood, or he might stand relative to what his kind of internal drivers really are. But then again, it is a question of, this is how reality exists, I'm trying to survive, and
absolutely.
let's not try to shift things in a way that we don't know how it'll go. I mean, there's a fear there, there's an apprehension. So the dualities that come to bear throughout this narrative that you've produced, they're complex. They're not very simple, and for lack of, I mean, no pun intended here, they're not black and white, right? So I like that, because often that's what you were saying, Stephen, that sometimes when those narratives are told from the outside, they tend to be very revisionist, right? So the nuances of that kind of resistance, even amongst individuals who find themselves in the same situation, you know, they're in the same space, they're affected by the same cultural norms, whatever the case may be, but they then themselves have a conflict, right? So that's what I'm interested in, based on what you said, Stephen, and what you've been speaking about, Nancy. How did you find your way to that nuance? Because this is a very nuanced story, right? So how did that come out? How did that kind of emerge?
Well, one thing I can tell you, when I was teaching in South Carolina, all my students had two names. African Americans in the South, in my experience, had two lives. They had the life among one another, where they were loving and friendly and helpful and got along and did things together. And then they were suspicious, as they should have been, of white people. So I made the mistake. The first time I knocked on a door, I used the real name, and everybody had another name. My co-author went by Poochie. And if you knocked on the door and asked for Ann or John, they'd say, I think you have the wrong address, or they're not home right now. But if you said, well, I'm here to see Poochie, come right in. Wow. So I think that by necessity, to survive, people, African American people and other people who are marginalized, have two personalities, which is a huge burden, if I'm right. It's a huge burden to carry. Who am I? Who does this person think I am? What's my goal here? How should I present myself? So I think that's part of how, the train porter, he actually could speak fine English, but he better not.
He chose to.
If he wants to be successful, get tips, keep supporting his family, he has to be very subservient.
Yeah.
So I think it all goes back. I mean, that summer, obviously, and I went back a second year and then the program was over, but that summer obviously changed my life.
Yeah.
I love the fact that, it says a lot about being able to know that second name. That nickname. Yeah. Because if you know that nickname, then that means that you're okay. Yeah. Because you've actually had an opportunity to really get to know the person. That person has opened up to you to say, well, my name is Poochie, and da-da-da-da. And so so if you were to call this person Poochie, then it's like, okay, well, she's good. She's a good person because she knows Poochie. Poochie allowed her to know her inner person. Rather than just knowing Ann, Ann Johnson. I'm like, okay, that's just so formal. And that can, and you're right. I guess to a degree that for people, especially in rural areas, I guess that can definitely be very intimidating when someone is calling you, someone outside of your family is calling you by your given name. Right.
Especially if they're white.
Yes, especially if they're white. Yeah.
Sorry.
That's it.
So that's an interesting take as well, right? This idea of, perhaps duality. To a certain extent, we all live some kind of duality relative to our kind of very internal culture and then what we present to the outside world. So what's interesting then, Stephen, is that the types of stories, the types of narratives that you bring to this community through Actors Warehouse, now that this has been said here about that kind of the two names, that's a beautiful kind of image, because I feel like a lot of the work that you've been doing that I've been privy to, I mean, you've probably been doing it much longer than that, but just what I've experienced, it's almost as though you're creating a space where you're bringing the community into that kind of internal story of characters, right? So is that something that's kind of a very kind of important value for you that you're carrying out, to kind of pull aside the veil and say, this is how, kind of the internal stories of characters, like, let's view this narrative from the second name perspective, that kind of thing. So you've given people an opportunity to come into that kind of space across many different, I mean, it may not just necessarily be issues of racial justice, but gender, identity, all sorts of, kind of themes, a lot of intersectionality that occurs here. Actors Warehouse being the nexus for such a thing, I guess. Right. So how did you find your way to that similar kind of understanding? Like, you wanted to let people into the internal narrative in the way that Nancy's kind of described that. Right.
Well, I had to start by saying that we were very fortunate. There was a review came out in the paper a while back. The theater critic for the Gainesville Sun wrote a review on one of our shows, and he gave this beautiful description, which we have since put it on our website, and it's one of the first things you see. And he basically, to sum it up, he's basically saying Actors Warehouse puts on plays that reveal the human condition.
Oh yeah.
That human condition, and it's like, and so I'm like, oh yes, that's it. That's exactly. He got it. And so, but yeah, that's what I like to do in as far as the productions that we put forth, is to show the and even the fragility of our human condition. It's about the fragility of our human condition, no matter what background we come from, and which is interesting because my background in theater, when I started theater, I'm a musical theater person.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm a singer, dancer, actor.
Yeah. Triple threat.
Right. That's great. So I was all about that. Yes, get on the stage and let's have some fun with the wonderful musical. I can say this because I'm an actor. Those mindless musicals.
It's funny.
And I was having fun with that. But it wasn't until I moved here to Gainesville and started doing, wanting to branch out in my directing, that I gravitated towards dramas. And the more poignant productions, subject matter. And so it's interesting how that came about, and I don't know. I'm still analyzing myself about that. I'm like, okay, what is it that happened with me? Because there was a shift in me somewhere along the way that wants these stories to be told. As an artist, you put forth what is within you, and so that's something I'm still kind of working with. Okay, what is it that happened within me, within my life, that shifted, and I'm using theater as that vehicle to tell the human story, but it's the same story that parallels with my story.
Sure.
Sure. So I'm still working on that. We'll save that for another podcast. But,
well, that may fill up a few, so that's a good narrative. But see, that's interesting because that then kind of brings our narrative back here, our shared narrative back to something that you had first mentioned, Nancy, right? Like there was, in the same way as Stephen has said, there was a particular moment in time that theater emerged in a different way, albeit, it wasn't the first emergence, but in a different way to facilitate a particular kind of transition, right? In the same way, when I had mentioned previously that, Anna directed this Pearl Clegg play, Flying West, and I played this particularly evil character. But, for me, it was a moment where I was processing a very difficult childhood and relationship with a father that kind of represented that kind of character, right? And it was a father that had recently passed. So there was a lot of processing, a lot of reflexivity, all of that was happening. And I've generally been a very private person when I reflect and process through a lot of emotional content. And Anne took me and put me in front of lots of people to do that in public. So it was actually a catharsis. It was a wonderful experience, and that's when I was hooked. Not just being on the stage. I mean, that was one thing, but theater, what theater can do. So you said, Nancy, that you came to this later in life. It was when you were 50. So what happened? Well, how did that bug, capture you?
Well, I'm afraid it doesn't relate in a great way to what we're talking about. I lived in Louisville for many years, and there was a little ad in the paper. Actors Theater was seeking 10-minute plays. I'd never written a play. I was interested in the fact that people seemed to be customizing their babies. Particularly, obviously, if you used IVF or you went to a sperm bank, you were trying to create a certain kind of child. Or if you were gay and you were using the turkey baster. Put this in a podcast. But anyway,
you can put anything.
These are TVMA podcasts.
So I wrote this 10-minute play about a clinic called Biogen Inc, where people were coming in to order babies who would be good on brass instruments or be tall so they could play basketball. Sent it to actors. I still have the letter I got back. It was a finalist out of 2,200 plays.
Wow.
So I said,
on your first. This
on my
is your
first play.
effort.
Wow, that's
I
great.
said,
Okay, guys, that doesn't happen often.
But I misunderstood. Part of it was luck, part of it was a play that was relevant to the times. And I thought, this is easy. I think I'll just start doing this. And then, the next play was so bad. I gave it to a legitimate playwright, and she said, I'm sorry, I can't even finish reading this. So that's when I started going to workshops and conferences and getting involved with theater groups. International Center for Women Playwrights was really helpful. Early on, I got connected with a director that I still work with on projects. So that's how I got started. It was a fluke. But I've always written from the time I was 5. I was writing little books, and so I don't know.
So how did that? How is there a differentiation, right? Because that's something that we're also very interested in here in terms of how our craft develops, right? And also relative to, and that's something particularly interesting to me, is how individuals use creative expression to heal, to grow, to manifest identity, to communicate with their community, to do many different things. I mean, these processes, these pathways. I mean, I have a friend who's been working on a novel for the past 6, 7, 8 years, and all of that has been his processing. And he's very public about this. So his processing, a very difficult trauma of kind of molestation in his childhood, and that has been his kind of healing vehicle, right? Is to put this out. Is to manifest it. Is to let it be known, so that it's not just something that kind of festers within him. So that's where the transition is interesting, right? So because it seems like though your kind of path in playwriting began as a fluke, but it really resonated with you, and yet you've written in other capacities all your life, right? So is there something different about this type of expression? Is there something different, perhaps? Is there a more acute path to character creation, or whatever the case may be? What is it that really draws you to this type of creative expression?
Well, I even think the play about the custom-made baby clinic was political. I try to say something even in my silly little comedies that I knock off 10-page comedies quite often.
Wow.
I mean, obviously this play is very political. It highlights sexism and racism, the incredible struggles that people had and still have in different forms. I don't know. Am I answering the question?
Actually,
zero.
No. That's a beautiful transition, because this is something that Stephen and Ann and I, when we sat with the director of this play at this point, Carolisa Hartigan, we approached this very briefly, but I think this is something that you could really speak to, right? Because there's this idea that at least that's formed for me, having been involved with Anne, with Stephen, seeing certain types of stories come to life that, as you say, that are very political, but also, I mean, I would also phrase it that they capture the current cultural zeitgeist in a beautiful way, but they occur at a different time, whether it be in the 70s, whether it be in the 40s, whether it be in the 1800s, whatever the case is. And my own reaction to that was when I saw audiences kind of navigating all the very difficult circumstances that are being portrayed on stage, that because they occurred at a different time, because maybe the costumes were different or whatever the case is, it felt like a safer approach to issues that are currently still very relevant, but if we perhaps portrayed them in a contemporary way, would be too charged or whatever the case may be. Do you find that to be the case in your own writing and in the way that you communicate very current, very contemporary political issues? Is it something that you kind of do in taking the story out of time or out of the current moment? Is that something that helps audiences find their way into a story?
I think you're right that historic plays do allow people to have experiences in their mind and their heart that they might not have if it was told in 2019. But I don't know I don't think my process is always the same anyway, but I just wanted to tell about this woman. If this story had happened in 2019, I would have still written it. It would have been a different story, but I just thought she was a remarkable human being. I do think history plays let us visit places that might be black in our heart. I didn't mean to say black.
Dark.
Dark.
Thank you.
I got it.
Yeah, we got it.
It's safer. And it also raises questions. I mean, a lot of kids today have no idea what their parents or grandparents went through, or anything about the marches or the assassinations. It's just like, doesn't touch them. But I think history plays give them a chance to say, what was it like when you were growing up? Or is that really true? How much of that was made up?
That's very true. Yeah.
Go.
Please.
I think it's very interesting that we've all sort of talked about these later in life transitions in the sense of a consciousness, I think, around a lot of different things. And especially, I just appreciate the curiosity with which you approach your work. It's really, that's what captures you first, is I want to know more.
Exactly.
And then these things start to develop, and at the same time, whether you know it or not, I think it becomes such a reflective exercise with you as the playwright. And I think we all sort of, in this sort of social justice realm at least, it's a highly reflective space for me. And that's how I started my theater career 20-30 years ago. I'm not going to say any more than that because it's all good.
Were you in your teens?
Yes, I was such a child. But it was through watching, as I directed, watching people, actors, usually young actors, develop a consciousness around the story. And that is, once that is set on a stage, then I shift to what's the audience, what's going on with the audience. And that being able to be in that world and in that conversation, that's what it is. It's a conversation about the very first thing that interested you in that. And I see that, like, if you do Shakespeare, you do the same thing. If you do anything by Aeschylus, I mean, you're still doing the same thing. It's this. So that's kind of where I am in the whole social justice world, that I don't want to ever enter it as I'm the white savior. I'm just, I happen to be white, and I happen to want to know what you're thinking and feeling, and that's kind of, but I'm constantly battling it, constantly going back to that question, am I being a white savior? It's constantly in my brain.
And that's good that we're examining that question.
It is, but that is still part of my meta question in the world for myself. You know, how can I promote equality and promote respect if I can't do that myself? And so every project has to be that reflective space and it's usually begins with a question. Oh, I don't know anything about, you know, transgender. Well, okay, let's dive in and see what happens. So, but I just really appreciate that you are still, you know, we're still curious. No matter how old we are, we're still curious. And the minute we stop being curious, we sort of stop
being human.
Yeah.
So that brings up an interesting point, and I mean, it was kind of like somebody had to bring up the buzzword of theater for social justice, right? Like that we it's been said now, so it's on the table. It should be, right? So that's an important segue, because relative to, and you know, kind of in working with Anne, there's kind of a different term that we've placed on some of our partnership, that it's kind of theater for community change, right? So there's an intentionality there, and I think that ties very much in, Nancy, to your idea of, you know, the work that I do, even in the, you know, 10-page comedies, they have a very specific message that is being communicated. So there's great intention in every. I imagine I'd love to see your process just when you sit down in front of your computer to write. Is it a computer or is it a legal pad?
Legal pads and napkins.
Excellent.
Or anything by hand.
This is a dying art to actually write by hand. I still do it too.
My children can't write script.
I know. Yeah. So there is some, for lack of a better way to say it, because I was going to speak about intersectionality in general, but there's a lot of intersections that come together, because you know, I worked with Anne through a play about immigrant justice, right, and immigrant border crossings, and there was a lot of initial questioning, initial reflexivity around the casting of those characters, that they weren't necessarily representative of the population that would make that particular journey. And there were a lot of different, you know, ideas. Anne herself, you know, we had some deep conversations about, you know, who am I to direct this, or, you know, what is my stance relative to this? And yet we found kind of a transcendent quality to this particular approach, and it seems like there's a tie between this particular play that was written by Kara Hartzler, No Roosters in the Desert, about 4 immigrant or 4 women that were making this crossing from the southern border of the U.S. Again, very topical, very timely. And then The Colored Door at the train depot. And the similar kind of way in, it was almost that I'm speaking it from my vantage point relative to what I saw Anne's process was, and I wonder if that came into play for you writing this particular a play about Mae Clark. Is that one aspect of the experience that was very personal to Anne was the journey that these women actually went through in a world that was not very open to them, culturally, from where they came from, culturally to where they were going. There were all of these different points of marginalization that occurred for them that was very much a parallel when juxtaposed to marginalization that occurred relative to race. So race and gender were the intersection there. So speaking to that, bringing that particular point out, without actually, you know, kind of leading the witness, so to speak, how did that come together for you relative to Anna's story as a woman and what she was going through? How did that play into this particular process for you to develop this narrative?
Well, several things. Anna's grandmother, who they all called Mama Lucy, was an extremely wise woman and an extremely hardworking woman. She did not let things get in her way. She accepted the, you know, segregation and the racism. Basically, that was she had to survive. But she knew there were other ways, and she encouraged Anna to look outside her community, to go to college. She was shocked that Anna wanted to become a WAC. I mean, at the time, there was no such thing as a woman soldier. They had to wait for Congress to get the idea. But even though, or maybe because Anna rose through the ranks quickly, I mean, she was smart, she worked hard, she was tireless, she really cared. She was an amazing patriot. She cared about her country, in spite of segregation. She still ran into a lot of problems at Fort Des Moines. I mean, she didn't call them problems, but if she hadn't had Mama Lucy raising her, when Anna saw the sign at the swimming pool that said, officers can't swim except right before we clean it, she might have, just screamed and led a protest, or, you could not get out of the Army once you enlisted. So she couldn't have gotten out. But she came at things with a thoughtful approach and chose what battles to fight and how to fight them. She wasn't involved. She originally, when she was a very young woman, late teens, or 20s, she wanted to join the march that Philip Randolph was organizing to get the president to allow or demand that African Americans be able to work in the military industry. But as she aged, she became calmer, more thoughtful, more focused. And I love the way, I don't know who to thank at the theater, Anna looked like, a typical 20-year-old at the beginning of the play, but once she was a WAC, she had such dignity, composure, sense
that sense of holding her own bearing.
Presence.
Yeah, such a
She
presence.
definitely was.
Yeah, and I give credit to Mama Lucy. Our family has such an important part to play in who we are, how we think about the world, what we try to do, what we're afraid to do. And Anna just got the right combination and chose her battles very carefully. The Franklin and Cliforda were, her brother and sister-in-law were very quiet people, very, I'm not going to say they accepted things as they were, but they were just good people. They weren't trying to change the world. Now, Franklin did change in the play, in the first act. And I wanted to show that Anna had a huge influence.
Indeed.
Not just on her family, but on everyone around her. The way she brought in that racist whack from Louisiana was wonderful. The scene was wonderful. We really got the idea. This is a mature woman who's been chosen to be one of the first African American officers in the WACs.
Speaking of going back to what you mentioned about being able to see the two, a different side of Anna. Now you see that very confident woman.
She was a leader.
Yes, you could see that she was a leader. Well, I guess we really have to thank the actress who pulled it together. Because Amanda, she pulled that together. It's like she and I sat down and we did some talking about it, about the character,
process,
through the process, and she was able to, to see that, well, she's an officer now. And she has to be a person of authority.
Yes.
And so it was just, very, very easy for her.
But not the kind of authority that's unpleasant.
No, absolutely.
She was careful. She wanted to bring people along.
Absolutely.
She wasn't just saying, you have to do what I say, I'm the boss.
And not pulling and not pushing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what was so interesting is the reliance in the first part on emotional, she was emotional and I'm so angry. Being motivated by that, but then she was motivated by, just being a leader. That her first thought was, how am I going to move this person, this incredibly racist person who only sees my black skin?
Right. Who was brought up to be
do that.
racist. That's what you're supposed to do.
To see me as a human,
Right.
which is what we're asking in the play.
Right.
You know,
Right.
that's what we're asking from
Right.
that history.
Yeah.
Is let's move people from one
Right.
place to another.
I would like to think if Anna had lived, she might have married and raised wonderful children who would have gone on to do good things like she did. I mean, that was another issue. I don't know the process. They didn't talk about it to me, Franklin and Cliforda. But she obviously knew she couldn't do much if she got married.
Yeah.
Because so many roles were already established. And just like, the kind of jobs that people of color were able to get.
Indeed.
Well, and it's also a woman's question at that time, and even today, I think women still struggle with,
Right.
choosing, feeling like you have to choose, but navigating the space where you don't.
Right. Right.
So there's we've kind of moved around this particular idea, and it's come out in very personal ways, and it's come out relative to this narrative that you developed, Nancy, that the word, and it's almost like a juxtaposition between the ability to accept or just live within the circumstances that are dictated for you because you're surviving, as opposed to the idea of taking a stand to really make a change, but being aware of the sacrifices that you have to make on a very personal level in order to do so. And the two characters that those two narratives are most kind of beautifully expressed by are Anna and then the porter, in terms of the two different perspectives. And there's gradations in between with Mama Lucy and Franklin, and everybody has a slightly different approach to just how far am I willing to go, but not beyond this particular line, right? So in terms of that being a very kind of nuanced but very powerful narrative within this story, Stephen, I'm wondering, relative to your personal experience, right? This is an experience that, especially with the work that you've done and what you've manifested in this community, it can't be forgotten where this community has come from and the history of this community, and the fact that there's still very kind of overt and kind of distinct approaches toward truth and reconciliation, as it's being termed in this community, because the effects of a lot of different types of injustice are still very relevant and still very present in this community here. And as a leader within this community, having not only established a space but held that space to essentially bring voice or lend voice or have a platform for individuals to communicate their voice around these particular issues in a very personal, very heartfelt way. How do you reflect on that relative to seeing Mae Clark's sacrifices that she made to stand up for what she believed in very, very powerful moments as they occur in this play, relative to your own experience in which you've had to, I'm sure, make different points of sacrifice to say, do I stay in one particular area where I can not only survive but thrive because I can do this in this way, or am I stepping out to take a different kind of stance, and it's a risk to me, but this is what I believe in, right? So is that part of this story, and especially not the story, but Anna's whole kind of presence and her commitment to this, did that resonate with you on a personal level in that context?
Well, personally, so both of my parents grew up in the South, in the segregated South. My father was born in 1927, and my mother was born in 1935.
Wow.
And they're still alive.
Yes. All right.
Yes. Yeah.
Wonderful.
And what is interesting is that, so in my family, so I'm the first generation in my immediate family to go into an integrated school. And it was I'm sure it was terrifying for my mother.
Mm-hmm. Oh gosh.
And I remember my godmother saying to me when it was actually my first day of school, going to first grade, because my pre-K, that was, kindergarten, pre-K and kindergarten, I went, we were all black students.
Mm-hmm.
I definitely remember that. But then when I got ready to go to first grade, I remember my godmother telling me, if any of them white kids call you a nigger, you pick up a rock and hit them. And I was like, well,
that's okay.
I have permission.
Yeah.
And there were instances where I did have to protect myself because I was called a nigger.
Wow.
And so little Johnny would use the word, and I'd hit him, and he'd cry to the teacher, and the teacher would say, and we would say, well, why did you hit him, Stephen? And I said, well, because he called me a nigger. And she says, well, Johnny, I'm sorry. Those are words you don't say.
Well, thank goodness.
Yeah, thank goodness. It could have gone either way.
It could have gone either way. But I look back on that now, and that was, and it wasn't just one teacher. Mm-hmm. It was, and these were white teachers. Mm-hmm. So there was sensitivity. Mm-hmm. And so I look back on that now, and I see that they were trained with sensitivity, mm-hmm. To understand what was going on, and actually teach the white students that because you hear this word, mm-hmm. just know that it is not right for you to use it and to mm-hmm. use it against someone to degrade them. So, but as far as my parents were concerned, I know, like I said, back to my mom, especially when she had to send me off to school, I'm sure she was terrified. And of course, with just any black mother, even to today, your child steps out the door, you're just absolutely terrified. Right. Mm-hmm. As to, what could happen, Mm-hmm. But I could still, to this day, I can still see both my parents being conditioned by the Jim Crow South, mm-hmm. and how they interact with people outside of the black community. I can see how they have been conditioned as to how they relate to me and the life stories, coping mechanisms that they give to me, that they share with me. Mm-hmm. I see that. But at the same time, I don't think my parents ever wanted me to be stifled in my creativity, in my living. Mm-hmm. I stepped out on my own to a degree, and even without them, I didn't go to them and say, okay, well, this is something I want to do. I would just do it, and I would get some pushback every now and then. But there are other times when I found that they would, like, okay, you just do what you need to do, but just be careful. That was always the message. Do what you need to do, but be careful.
Do you think you changed them?
I don't know. That's a good question. That is a very good question.
Ask them.
Yeah, I will. I will have to ask them.
Because that's a way that the world can change.
Yeah.
If the children change the parents.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot. There's a part of me that sometimes there is this internal struggle of wanting to break free of those life lessons that they taught me, just knowing where they were rooted.
Sure.
You see what I'm saying?
Sure.
Because I think there's still a lot of life lessons that we in the black community still teach our children, and it is, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, a lot of it is still rooted in slave mentality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what I want to rid myself of. Mm-hmm. Is that, that slave mentality, and I'm constantly questioning myself and challenging myself.
Yeah.
If I find myself I find myself wanting to do X, Y, Z, but then all of a sudden there is this resistance. I say, okay, why is there a resistance? And my, is that slave mentality saying, playing in the background saying, oh, well, you can't do this because, these folks over here, they're going to be upset with you, especially, and when I say these folks, is I'm talking white folk, they're going to be upset with you, and question you and say, well, who are you to, put this message out? Or who are you to achieve this and achieve that in your life? This educational goal, this this status symbol. Go out and buy that particular car or buy that house or what have you. So that's still I'll admit, it's still somewhat of an internal struggle for me. Because that lesson, that life lesson has been, implanted in me. And so it's about me processing it, really working around it and say, okay, that doesn't serve me,
And at the same time, I think the white community, at least we're constantly navigating the privilege. We're constantly having to check ourselves. I mean, the ones who care.
The ones who see exactly.
And it's constantly going back to, I'm not the white savior. I'm not, and constantly having to navigate. Well, how do I speak to a black person without coming across
right
that I'm trying to change, make you more blonde or something,
Right.
So I understand from a different perspective, and it's not a historical. Yours is a deep pain and deep historical pain. Mine is more, just always been this way, and having no ability to navigate something that is just as much in my DNA from the same time, but I have to constantly confront that. It's not black people. It's anyone that's different. And that is so in the white DNA that we are better. And we constantly come up against that, and I don't know when that'll ever end. And I want it to end, and I want to be part of that. But it's just so much there. I mean, I'm constantly checking myself.
So this is a really, and Nancy, this is usually how I kind of like to bring home the podcast, right? I'd like to kind of circle back to everything that we've been reflecting on, and this is really important, because Stephen, even as you were saying, like this particular perspective of like I've had that thought before, like whether it's slave mentality in my own Indian heritage, it's a very kind of reactionary mentality to imperialist rule, kind of like there's that kind of perspective, whereas even it's now, just to kind of situate where we are, it is currently 2019, and we're still talking about a lot of toxic narratives, and a lot of people that are in my own kind of Indian American community, the way forward is to, and just to be very kind of simply stated about it, is to be white. And white is better, and that's how if you have a choice, you kind of subvert aspects of your heritage in order to act white, and the more accepted you are, that's what this set of brown people tends to occupy a space where I have all my white friends, and it's almost, people have said that to me, like if I didn't see you, I'd hear you on the phone and think you were a white guy, and it's said in this seemingly innocuous way, and I'm sitting and thinking, but what that really means in my own reflexivity is that I can't claim being well-spoken or educated in any way aside from being white, right? So this is important, and the resistance, because this is something that's been a big takeaway for me, especially going back to the porter in this story. I've now begun to understand it, that there's a lot of individuals who just, look, let me be. If they're people of color, I just want to survive in this situation that I have. This is what reality looks like. I'm doing well. Let's not rock the boat, because not everyone wants to change it, or not everyone wants to go in that particular direction. And yet it's the only direction we will go in. And things are shifting, and they can shift in a very toxic way, or they can shift in a path towards interdependence, right? And that's kind of, I think, what we're all at this table to do. So in order to kind of bring this home, Nancy, you wrote this beautiful narrative. It's a challenging narrative. It is being brought to life through the Actors Warehouse and through this particular grant with the Florida Humanities Council. And there's a lot of individuals that have come together, and I always feel privileged to be able to be at a table like this, because I don't know if you guys noticed, but this was a heck of a shared experience here, right? So wait till you hear what this actually sounds like once it's produced. But a lot of really important points have come across. So if that is the case, then let's kind of close with that idea of intention, right? So Nancy, this is a story that you put together to honor someone that should most assuredly be honored in many different ways. I mean, just seeing her portrayed on stage has been something that has, even recently, just sitting in the back taking some photos of rehearsal, has spoken to me relative to actual challenges I'm facing right now in real time. And I thought, oh, look at this, look what's happening. So that effect is happening. And as Anne is saying, there is a constant reflexivity that she goes through, as Stephen is saying, that I keep, kind of evaluating, like, these are great outcomes. Is that your intention with this narrative, with this story? You brought this into the world. Is it your intention to, or rather, again, let me back off of that and just say, what is your intention? What has been your intention with this story?
I'd like people to appreciate Anna Mae Clark's bravery, sacrifices, how she came from what many people would consider nothing, a poor rural community in Kentucky. And I want people to think about the fact that they have choices to make. They can make choices that will enhance community, that we don't have to be divided, that has been imposed upon us for centuries, but that we will all gain more if we try to understand each other and work together.
Very well said.
I have something else that
Please.
you may not want, but it doesn't belong at a conclusion.
It all belongs. It's part of it.
Well, in 1976, the county and city school systems were merged in Louisville, Kentucky, which suddenly meant we had integrated schools. Because the inner city was mostly black, the outer, suburbs were mostly white. There were adults who threw bricks at the buses, trying to keep the kids from getting on. It was a little bit like Little Rock. But the Courier-Journal, the local newspaper, had a picture of the first day of first grade, a bunch of empty desks, but the first two kids to get there, one was black, one was white, and there was a picture of them shaking hands. And I just thought, there's hope.
Yeah. And you bring that hope out through your writing. There's one line that's really impacted me, that in her maturity, as everyone was saying, that in that specific moment, Anna's character speaks to one of her colleagues about the kind of the racist private, in that particular scene, saying, she's not the enemy, right? That's a beautiful line. It reverberated in so many ways for me.
Right.
And so if in fact that photo really inspired you because there was hope at that time, I think that hope is being carried on. So, on behalf of everyone at the table, Nancy, as the playwright for this remarkable play, I thank you for bringing it into existence, for manifesting it, and for sharing your kind of deeper personal perspectives as to how this came to be today. And Stephen, it's your house. This is the place where you hold the space where these types of narratives come into play. And I can reflect that my experience with you also causes me to self-evaluate all the time. So I'm with you, man. Like we're always doing that. That's a good place to be. And there is nothing to be said but for the fact that, and you have always inspired me and then held me accountable to be reflexive at all times. So thank you to, again, what are you? You're the consulting scholar for this particular project.
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
If you could see my degree.
Yeah, indeed. Stephen, the artistic director of Actors Warehouse and the program director for this entire project, and Nancy Gall-Clayton, the brilliant playwright for this particular very relevant, very important, very timely, and very necessary story. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be with all of you.
Indeed. All right. There we are. And that's a wrap, folks.